Good, heck is it? It's afternoon. It's a good Sunday afternoon. Here we are in business law. I'm going to get some of this stuff out of the way a little bit before next week, because I'll be in search committee stuff for the provost all next week, so hopefully I can get some of this stuff completed. So it's our last week. Just have one final test that you guys will have to take, and as a reminder, it is not comprehensive. I keep reminding people that, so you don't go study the whole book and everything else. It's not comprehensive. Simply over the last 3 chapters plus the conversation that we're going to have today on creditor debtor relationships. So comments. I'm pretty well caught up, I think, on all of the discussion, grading, and whatnot. So I kind of, obviously, you guys can answer today still, or get in today on some of these. So maybe a couple comments. Nothing in particular. These were particularly noteworthy, I guess, but not any of them were bad either. The Pizza Hut Thanksgiving thing, yeah, I think we all, apparently not, I was going to say we're all kind of upset with some of the stuff that's gone on, but, the truth is people still go shopping. I know when we went up to Hingham to my in-laws for Thanksgiving, and on the way home, of course, I had to drive past Walmart, and it's like 6 o'clock Thanksgiving evening. The place was packed. I didn't know there's that many cars in Havre. And then the Kmart parking lot had a pretty good collection of folks too. Yeah, go home, people. Go home, eat supper, watch football. Do the things you're supposed to do on Thanksgiving. That's the only people that ought to be working, is the people that are playing football on TV that are bringing us those things. Anyhow, sage grouse. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the areas where they're really trying to save them are more because of gas or oil exploration. So, what might happen? Could the fact that some of those areas have become less of a habitat maybe affect us up here because there's fewer? So I don't know. Is MSUN getting a black eye? Yeah, of course. These things always happen. Oftentimes it's with athletes and whatnot, and it just makes better press. Having been involved in the athletic department here at Northern, the one thing I do want to point out is that athletes in general have a lower incidence of being involved in those issues than the general population. Nationwide, they tend to have a little bit higher GPA than the general population. So a lot of times the stereotypes that we apply to our athletes don't really fit, when you look at the stats. But the thing about it is, of course, since in this case Joe was an athlete, and a prominent one, and now an employee at the college, that seems to make better news than if it was just Bob or Pete or somebody else, that maybe wasn't an athlete. So, yeah, that's just kind of the way it goes sometimes. Yeah, OSHA Black Fry, I like that one. Because, how do you protect your workers when you got this onslaught of idiots coming through the door? So, the sriracha or whatever it is, yeah, I tried some of that here the other day. I've tried it before, but that's good stuff, so I hope they're not closed for long. Yeah. There's always the chance that they'll just pick up and go find a different place, take their employees and go someplace else. Walmart and unions finally got the link fixed. Not a bunch of comments on that, and that's fine. The negative review, yeah. What's our First Amendment rights when it comes to those types of things? And Macy's, yeah, I don't know. And then the height and weight one, this one still intrigues me, because when I do, and I gave the example in my lecture last week about Hooters, Hooters has said, hey, it works. It allows us to attract clients and be more profitable if we have certain requirements. The difference there is being able to prove it. Okay, and so that's important. You do have to prove that it's a necessity for that particular position. So, these will continue to be interesting. I think that we'll have more and more debates about things like tattoos. You guys brought that up. And whether or not those, if you work in a conservative bank, is it okay not only to have tattoos but to wear, clothing that reveals those tattoos, be they on their arms or your legs or wherever they might be, neck. Those things are, I'm glad I'm not a judge that has to make determinations about those. I'm kind of two minds there too. I mean, I understand folks wishing to do that, and I also very much understand many small business especially, but even bigger businesses, it's their business. They own it. And should they be able to put some restrictions on, maybe the appearance of people? Should they be able to require that guys wear ties and gals wear, proper suits or, business type dress? I don't know. I tend to think that we have to look at both sides and not just one when we start assessing those types of things. So anyhow, on to chapter 17. Get to talking here about the EPA. And of course you guys can get into these and read them. But so the primary reason for environmental regulation, of course, is concern over the effects that we're having, of growth, human growth, and the use of resources, on and on and on. My wife always said she wanted a riding lawnmower, so I finally broke down and got her one. She's still complaining. I don't know. This is supposedly the dirtiest coal-fired plant, or was at the time. If I had to guess, the dirtiest one now is in China. There's some good, clean, pure water. So that movement began for environmental in the 1960s, and it started with some government. Let's say that the governmental regulatory movement began in the 1960s. There were still methods of enforcing environmental things prior to that, but the government kind of got involved more in the 60s. And first, of course, it could regulate itself and then regulate business, and then it got involved in the suits by private businesses. Old humor back when Bush and Cheney were president and vice president. You should be able to find some good articles on coal and all that other good stuff that's going on. And the CO2. So there's kind of some federal environmental protection laws. And there's quite a few of them. And honestly, I'm try not to get too in depth on the test on these, and that you have to know every single one. You should know, that when the EPA was set up and some things like that, probably, and there'll be some other ones that I'll try to point out will be test worthy. I think this was important too. I added this, obviously, with the older textbook, but the Supreme Court in 2007 ruled that CO2 was in fact a pollutant and gave the EPA the rights to regulate it. And that's some of the news, I think, that maybe you guys could Bing or Google or something and try to find some good articles on that, because I think it'd be kind of interesting. So the National Environmental Policy Act took place in 1970 and was started to require environmental impact statements. There's still criticisms, right, that that the environmental impact statements fail to consider economic injury of maybe doing a project or not doing a project. But we consider too many alternatives, too descriptive, they're not analytical enough, on and on and on. And so there's several criticisms. Now, EIS, and we'll get into that a little bit. But the EIS is required whenever there's a major action, certainly a federal action, anything where the federal government's involved. When they redid the Highway 2 through Havre, downtown, of course, that was all, not all funded, but funded to a decent extent by the federal government and the state government. But in any event, of course, an environmental impact statement had to be completed in order for that project to go forward. A lot of ski hills are on Forest Service ground, and if they want to do anything, of course, they have to do environmental impact statements, and on and on and on. So they examine these things, right? Any adverse environmental impacts that might happen. If we're committing natural resources, right, that'll be irreversible, that we can't come in and fix at some point in time. It has to take a look at some, at least, and like they said in the prior slide, it's oftentimes too many alternatives. The whole energy production and stuff gets to be interesting. So, government's regulation of business, again, began with the Environmental Protection Agency, which was established by that National Environmental Policy Act in 1970. And it covered things like air, water, endangered species, pesticides, different things like that of course you can read about. And there was a you go back in time, you could read it. I think it was over in Ohio someplace, but there was literally a river in the U.S. that some industrial plants were discharging into, and the river caught on fire. The fire started someplace and it got down to the river, and it didn't go out. And that was actually one event, I think, among many, that got a lot of people thinking that, even if you weren't an environmentalist, so to speak, maybe some regulation of the levels and amounts of pollution that we put into the environment might be reasonable. And I think most of us would agree, and I think that there's been a lot of successes. Some of us might argue that we go a little bit too far. Of course, others would argue that we still don't go anywhere near far enough. But that's those are good arguments to continue having, and we have to weigh those against the needs of the people, and etc. So air pollution, we talked about clean air, some of the standards. There's primary and secondary. Primary is what comes right out of a smokestack, say, and secondary then is the larger area, or I think we'll talk about in a bit the bubble, the whole area around it that may well be affected by that type of a pollution source. Air pollution sources can include a couple things. They can be stationary, which of course would be like power plants and whatnot, or mobile, meaning our vehicles, right? Planes, trains, and automobiles. Didn't they make a movie about that? I think so. Compliance, waivers, and variances. Yeah. And one of the things they've talked about is cap and trade with carbon. Putting that in place, and they kind of did that with regular pollution, different types of pollution, mercury, soot, whatever the case may be. And they originally they started to they set some standards, but they'd allow companies to exceed those standards, but then companies would have to buy waivers or those types of things. And other companies that vastly exceeded the standards might actually get credits, and they could sell those to companies. So they could do some buying and selling and trading. And it really worked effectively, because actually companies found out that going ahead and complying ended up making more sense than continually buying, purchasing the waivers. and so it's come a long ways in reducing the pollution that we have. So air quality index, we don't, I've never seen an air quality worry for here in good old Havre. I've been in other towns when they had it, Spokane, Denver actually, and Missoula, at times when they've had, I can remember being in Denver and they said, if you don't have to, don't go outside. So, clean air, trends anyhow. Point source to the bubble concept. And that, again, it gets back to kind of the primary or where it actually emanates from, and then the area that it covers. Emissions reduction banking, that's what I was talking about, was if you're substantially or more in compliance than what's necessary, you may have credits that you can actually sell to others, increasing your profits. If you're less in compliance, then you can actually go to the free market and purchase those credits. So what we're trying to do, again, is prevent any significant deterioration. So kind of at least now keep it kind of where we're at. Then we get to clean water. This too, if you want to get into a couple of articles that I think would be really good for this next week, we're talking about the CO2 regulation, but the navigable waterways have been in the news lately, and this really affects our area more so than in the past, and I'll talk about that just as we get down there a little bit. So the Clean Water Act talked about navigable waterways, and what's been in the news is that they've changed or are in the process maybe of changing the definition of what's a navigable waterway or what affects a navigable waterway. Okay? And again, it says no discharge from a point source without permit. So, for example, Havre's treatment facility, all the sewage that leaves Havre goes through a treatment facility, and that water's cleaned up, and it does get discharged, I'm sure, into the Milk River for the people of Chinook to drink, but it doesn't get discharged until it's reached a certain level of cleanliness, right? And they have to have a permit that assures those things. So, not yet reached is non-point source, and that's when we start talking about the agriculture, right? And what happens with the stuff that we spray or put on our fields, the fertilizers, the pesticides, and those types of things. And that's where this navigable waterways comes in, because what they're trying to do is stretch that definition to include streams or even seasonal streams that would end up draining into and affect truly navigable waterways. And so the new push could extend a lot of environmental protection or environmental rules and regs to places that right now don't exist. So we'll see. When they originally set these up, and I think they're still this way, and I'm pretty sure this isn't on the test, but because it's changing, companies or places could install the first best practicable technology or the second best available technology. It was kind of an either or at that point in time. So, Endangered Species Act, you guys had some discussion going about that with sagebrush. Wonderful. Like it. Species do disappear. I know there's some talk about that. Sometimes it's from natural things. Sometimes it's because of human effects. And humans have obviously increased habitat for a number of species. I joke about how my mom grew up in Scobie, northeast Montana, and when she grew up, she never saw a deer. Didn't hardly know what a deer was. Much like we never see really elk or moose in this area, but occasionally. But back then, there was an occasion where a deer might wander in there. And now you can't drive to Scobie, unless you're dodging deer all the way. And they're so thick up there, it's unbelievable. And so humans have also created some habitat. So it's kind of sometimes 6 of one, half a dozen the other, but creating habitat for certain species, obviously it affects other species. So some of the considerations are destructions of critical habitat. The sage grouse are a particularly interesting species because they do require the sagebrush. Disease and predation. This was your guys' discussion about the bees. We had difficulties with our whitetail, population because of the disease this year. Commercial recreational activity, how do we balance those things? Rivers, dams, water that's held back, on and on and on. Other natural man-made factors, right? We're getting into more and more pesticide control. And so far, really, they have to be registered, they have to be accepted, obviously. They have to be effective, and have to, at least at the quantities that they're applied and whatnot, have no real adverse effect. And applicators have to be licensed in most cases, and those licenses are not necessarily for. There's certain licenses if you're just doing your own, and if you're going to commercially apply, obviously you have to get a different license, and so. Those are a pretty good way to regulate those things. So some other things, solid waste disposal. We got a few different things under here. Why that heading is up there like that. But anyhow, we also have a Clean Air Act, which we talked about. Noise Control Act. So things with airplanes, things like that make lots of noise. They can kind of control those and regulate it at certain decibels. Solid Waste Disposal Act. Hill County just recently had to put in place a new solid waste disposal facility, landfill. It had to comply with a lot of things. They were actually fortunate to purchase some land that had a significant clay base, and so it prevent the seepage of some of this waste material and stuff, the leaching of it down into the water, table and whatnot. And so it saved us a lot of money, actually. So anyhow, and a lot of that probably came from some of this research and whatnot. So what goes in landfills? Mostly paper. Look at that, 50% paper. That's kind of surprising. We always thought when computers were invented that we would get away from paper, and we're getting there a little bit. I've gone from going through several reams of paper every semester to using hardly any, and so I think we're finally starting to reach some of those goals of cutting that back a little bit. Toxic substance control. This might have to do with some of the things that they use for inventing makeup and those types of things. But I don't know a lot about that. Probably not something I'm going to test you on. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Now this was big. Okay. Determine if waste is hazardous, waste properly transported, those types of things. Actually, that's not the one that I was saying was huge. The next one is the huge one. I'm sorry, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA. Kind of maybe try to remember that acronym there, that's CERCLA. Done in 1980. It was a Superfund. Okay, CERCLA is what set up the Superfund. And that's one that probably would for sure be on a test. So it's important to note that. Okay, and that was set up, and that was huge, and it started out as pretty tough because it kind of was supposed to be government working in conjunction with businesses to try to clean up some of this stuff, maybe share some resources, etc. But as it kind of got going a little bit, then they ended up having just all kinds of lawsuits because they were trying to figure out who should be responsible for it. And they spent more time, in courts. And there was, I think at one time, the statistic I looked it up, there was 20,000 lawyers in the United States that made their primary living from dealing with Superfund types of issues. And if you see some of those cases, you'll know. You'll see companies, look at the Pegasus mine that was over, near Fort Belknap, and that company went bankrupt. Okay, who's responsible now for cleaning up? And so you got lawsuits and all kinds of stuff going on. And that has to do with this down here, right? Who is responsible? For a while in banking, it got kind of dicey because they were actually going to make banks responsible for cleanup if the banks had a security interest. So if you took a mortgage on some property and it turns out the property had any environmental hazards, the bank itself might be responsible, even though they didn't engage in any of the management or anything. And so it was kind of dicey. That lasted for about 18 months or 2 years, and then they kind of came up and decided that maybe they had to show that the bank actually had a management interest in it to make them responsible. So cost recoveries, and I think I got another slide. No, I thought I had another one that showed how they were continuing. There's still cost recoveries. That means that they're suing businesses and getting money in order to help clean these things up. Okay? And so there's still a ton. I think the Superfund's starting to be used a bit more what it was originally intended to be. With more cooperation, trying to get some things cleaned up versus this fighting. There have been proposals. One is pro-rate liability. So if you've owned it the last 6 years, and maybe you were still responsible for some of the damage, but a lot of the damage was done before you even owned it. Maybe you shouldn't be responsible for all of it. Maybe the government could step in for some of those things. Exempt small contributors of waste. Same thing. If you're real tiny, small business, maybe you should be exempt from some of these things. Clean up, meet health and safety standards. So, one of the original way to enforce environmental stuff was by citizen enforcement. So before any of the regulations and whatnot came along, there's nothing that prevented one person or company from suing another person or company. We've talked about those things. If your neighbor's yard is a dump, you've got some rights that you can go to the courts over and try to get them to enforce, right? And that's always been the case, and a lot of environmental law probably started in those areas. Okay, so there's tort theories, nuisance, public versus private. Again, now, of course, the public can come in and push those things. But in the old days, it was just private against private. Trespass. Yeah, and that can happen. If you're producing chemicals on your property and you're releasing them, and they're getting over onto your neighbor's property, that's technically a trespass, right? And of course, the main tort theory there was the negligence. That you've got a duty, right? And breach of duty, all those other things, causation, that can create problems and can create hassles or create legal liability for people that are supposed to be doing. And then there's strict liability. So some companies, some industries that engage in certain practices, they're going to be held strictly liable, if they cause harms. So some more trends and areas of concern. Loss of natural ecosystems. We've seen companies that have actually been ordered to create new wetlands, say, if where they're building is destroying a wetland. So you'll see different things like that. Ozone's kind of gone from our conversation. That was, 15 years ago. That was kind of before global warming really started to dominate the conversation. Ozone was a big deal, and in fact, we changed the fluid that we use in our air conditioners. We went from Freon to C132 or whatever the heck it is, right? Because it's non-free Freon or didn't hurt the ozone. And same thing with the propellant that's in our aerosols. It used to be that those had like Freon in it that they said was damaging to the ozone. Supposedly now the ozone's doing okay. Greenhouse effect, in the news constantly. The IPCC just finished meeting. Okay, population growth. And you've seen some nations take dramatic steps towards reducing population growth. Corporate governance. Do corporations themselves, do they take it to heart that maybe they need to protect some of the property, some of the things? Should they have social responsibility and maybe be good citizens? And might that be good for business also? And then private property and the rights that we have, and the abilities that we have to enforce, right? Our own, again, your neighbor can't have a dump unless it's permitted, right? and you have a right to protect that. So, good. So there's EPA. Let's jump right in and get talking about creditor-debtor relations. Yeah, there's just an article, so we don't need to. This isn't in your book. This is some stuff it's a little bit of it accumulated myself. Some of it, though, maybe from another older text that I had. But in my mind, it's important both as a consumer and as a business person. Things that you can do, right? Creditors have rights to collect. If you give somebody some money, certainly you have a right to try and get your money back if in fact you're entitled to it. And some certain professions have rights to create liens. Mechanics, for example, okay, adjusters, which are horse keepers or critter keepers, whatever you want to call it. So might be cows, might be whatever. Artisans are folks that create things. I suppose back in the day it was blacksmiths and those types maybe. Okay, and they have a right. So if you take your car in, right, to get fixed, and it's $1,000 bill, and you go to pick it up and you don't have the $1,000. Tony or Bob down at or Dale, I should say, down at the mechanic shop, they can they can put a lien on your vehicle, and they don't even have to give you back your vehicle. They can just keep it in that case. And then that lien would allow them to actually take possession of it. There's certain things that you can go through. Then they could sell it and recoup their money in that case, right? Other than that, other people have to go through more difficult processes, okay, in order to establish liens against folks. When you do that, you can get an attachment. I like the order that I have this, because normally you go to court and you get a judgment, and we talked about that, and we probably should have talked about getting a judgment first, and then you would get the right to attach property, and the court would allow you to enforce that through a writ of execution. Okay, you can garnish people's wages, right? And you can only garnish, so up to 25% of a person's wage. They feel that 25% is adequate, or 75%, the person should be able to hopefully still live, buy groceries, etc. Okay, and you can also foreclose on property or repossess some property, depending on what type of property it is. Foreclosure would be for real property, real estate, and repossession would be for personal property, things like vehicles and those types of things, right? Debtors have a right to a homestead exemption, and that I don't think I asked about that on the test, and it's a relatively simple concept. Sometimes it's difficult to explain. Folks have the right to. Oops, excuse me for a second here. There we go. Okay, so folks have the right to exempt. Say their home. Okay, it actually protects them from certain creditor actions. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can absolutely keep your home and not have to pay for it. But it prevents somebody from, say, a hospital. If you built up a bunch of hospital bills through no fault of your own, just because you were sick, the hospital has a right to collect. No question about that. But filing homestead exemption means that they can't foreclose upon your house without at least the protection of the court, bankruptcy court maybe in that case. Okay? And so that's kind of what a homestead exemption amounts to. And you do have to file one, okay, in order to get that type of protection. You can also exempt to a certain extent some personal property. And this has to do with going through bankruptcy again. Okay, furniture, tools of the trade. Okay. basic furniture, and vehicles. Now, that doesn't mean if you got a vehicle, again, that you get away from paying for it, but you don't have to liquidate it. If you go through a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, you don't necessarily have to liquidate that vehicle. You can keep it, but you do have to continue to make the payments on it. And that might be the same, too, for some furniture and tools if you actually owe money. So, bankruptcy, we got these types of things. And contrary to maybe popular belief, you want to call it that, but being a banker, of course, you would think that I would be absolutely opposed to bankruptcy, but truly, bankruptcy allows people to take some risks. And those risks might not be taken without some method of liquidating or protecting, those risk takers. And I think that's really important for our system. Actually, now, are there people that abuse bankruptcy? Absolutely. But I think without risk takers and without some means, in the old days they threw people in debtor's prison. How the heck are you going to pay back anything if you're sitting in debtor's prison? They make the families try to pay them back. Once again, that's tough to do. You're probably the main breadwinner, and then you're sitting in the hoosegow, and how you gonna be able to pay things back? And so, bankruptcy allowed us for ways and allowed the courts to deal with situations like that. Okay, and hopefully, we've created a system that it's not perfect, but people can still abuse it. But it's tough. It's not simple to abuse it. People that do abuse it, they just end up being tough shape anyway. So, bankruptcy, we saw a huge increase here and then a big drop off. The change in the bankruptcy law in 2005. There's a big change in the bankruptcy law. So people, knowing that it was coming, actually filed a lot of bankruptcies, and then it dropped off and has inched back up again because of the recession, of course. So Chapter 7 bankruptcy is actually liquidation, okay? And that's for both consumers or businesses. And what that means is all the assets, basically, of the individual or the business go to the court. And the court appoints a trustee, and the trustee's job is to basically sell the assets and recoup however much money, and then apportion that properly. So if I had the mortgage on your house, and your house did get sold, then that money would come back to me. Okay, that wouldn't get apportioned to other debtors, that would get apportioned to me. Or if I had lien on your car, same thing. And this is where that homestead exemption and those things, personal exemptions, might come into play, where you could ask the bankruptcy judge, bankruptcy court, to keep your home, and if the lender agreed, or oftentimes the judge imposes it anyways, whether the lender agrees or not, you might be allowed to keep your home, but you're going to have to keep making the payments on it. Okay. Sometimes, I suppose, in cases like we had where home values had decreased substantially, the judge might actually force the lender to refinance it, and even occasionally, but rarely, lower the principal amount that's owing. So they have to write off some of it, maybe, to allow you to stay in that. Okay, let's go on to Chapter 7, still non-dischargeable debts, so things that you can't get rid of. Okay, you can't get rid of paternity or alimony. So if you're required to make payments for those things, or maintenance, child support, those are all kind of the same thing, right? Some other things that aren't dischargeable would include student loan debts, IRS, okay? Different things like that, or you don't get rid of those just because you file bankruptcy. Things that you can't exempt, we talked about that, or that creditors can't take, or if you filed an exemptions, right? Residence, vehicle, household goods, certain jewelry, investment jewelry, they can come get. Okay, but personal jewelry, your earrings, your wedding rings, those types of things, you're allowed to keep those, right? Life insurance, health, Social Security benefits, those types of things. Okay, again, if you keep a vehicle and you have a loan against it, you're going to have to keep making the payments. Okay, you're probably going to have to demonstrate to the court that you have the ability to make those payments. Chapter 12 it isn't really in existence anymore. Okay, and so we're going to kind of skip over that. There's actually still some old farms and ranches that are operating under Chapter 12 agreements, but that's it. It was just a special code of bankruptcy to deal with farms and ranches. Chapter 13 is wage earner or consumer, if you want to call it that, right? Where instead of asking the court to take your property, sell it, liquidate it, and disperse the proceeds, it says, no, maybe I can make payments. I just need to restructure some of this stuff. And a lot of Chapter 13s that I saw were because of medical, and through people's, one customer that I had, and he was a good customer, paid the bank just reliably as heck, and he'd been through Chapter 13 because his wife had fought cancer for years, and the expenses were just onerous, and he never tried to walk away from the expenses, but honestly he just couldn't pay the amounts that were required. And so he went to the bankruptcy court, and the bankruptcy court basically looked at his income and said, well, here's what you need to live, and anything above that is going to go to the hospital. And he paid that faithfully. And if he came in, the court would allow him, if he needed to, come in, buy a car or something, it was reasonable, and make payments and whatnot. But as long as he kept the payments up to the hospital or through the bankruptcy court, whichever the case may be, is fine. And, so those things happen, and that's what Chapter 13 is about. With the change in 2005, remember I was just telling you about the change in the bankruptcy in 2005. One of the biggest changes was they actually moved a lot of Chapter 7s at the judge's discretion. A lot of those can be moved into Chapter 13s. Well, what happened? What happened for a while, and the banks and creditors got fairly upset about it, was that individuals, for the most part, it has to be for Chapter 13, but they might go out and rack up a bunch of debt, right? Especially credit cards or unsecured debts. And it might be a doctor or a lawyer that's making $500,000 a year, and they just rack up debts. Sometimes it was debts that they'd gotten in school, not government student loans, but other debts, credit cards, whatever. And then they'd file bankruptcy, Chapter 7, and it would just clean the slate for those types of unsecured debts. They could keep their house, right? Keep making payments on that, keep their car, keep making payments on that, but they would then quit making payments on those unsecured debts and get rid of that. And creditors kind of said, maybe we need to have a method of still allowing them to pay, and that's basically what the change was. And debtors kind of said, well, wait a minute, maybe the creditors deserve some of the blame here, because maybe they shouldn't be extending credit, in cases like that, and they're right to a certain extent as well. So, but in any event, the change is passed, and so bankruptcy courts have a wide discretion that if somebody comes in, and what they usually determine is if they have capacity, the ability to repay, even if it's not the full amount, they'll move them over from a 7 to a 13 and force them to make payments. They'll put their wages under the control of the court and force them to make payments even on some of those unsecured credits. In Chapter 11 is business reorganization, and we see this. You and I are familiar with companies that have gone through Chapter 11. Most of us get our heat and electricity through Northwestern, which has been through Chapter 11. Many of us go to Kmart and pick up some things, and they've been through Chapter 11. There's been a lot of businesses that have been through Chapter 11s. Okay, and what happens there is much like the personal restructuring, is that sometimes just the terms or whatever on the debts that they have aren't workable, and sometimes the creditors are unwilling to work with them, so they go to the bankruptcy court, and the bankruptcy court says, okay, we're just going to force the creditors to rewrite some of this stuff. And we went through a lot of these at the bank. I found these to be interesting. I got involved in more of these than I really cared to, but on the other hand, I also found them to be kind of interesting, because you'd really have to weigh what the business people were telling you versus what you thought they could do. And often we'd get in fights because we would tell the court we don't think the person can perform. We'd just as soon see them forced into a Chapter 7 and take our hit now, sell whatever, and whatever little bit we get out of it, let's call it good and we'll move on. And of course they were trying to convince us that they could reasonably manage those things. So it was interesting. Credit scoring, yeah, it's gaining widespread. I think credit score has really become a huge deal, and we've become a nation, or we're becoming a nation of haves and have-nots, right? And it's interesting. I'm not all in favor of it, and maybe as this goes on I'll be able to tell you a few reasons why. But lenders, insurers, insurance, insurance. Can your car insurance get your credit score, number one, and then number two, can they use that to help determine your rates? And the answer is yeah. And how they did that is that they were able to prove, insurance companies, that people who pay their bills, who have good high credit scores, are also safer drivers, number one. And number two, companies don't have to spend money trying to look for them to get paid, because they just pay reliably on time. And so they're cheaper customers, if you want to put it that way. Landlords, I've used credit reports anyhow in the past, not so much credit scoring, but I may end up going to that. It used to be a 620 cliff. This is under the FICO scores. You might look up the FICO. And I would say that the 620 cliff's gone away. It's gone away, but that's the old one. I think that's on the test too, maybe. I would say that the new cliff is probably closer to 700, maybe 720. And that's a fairly high standard. That's a fairly high standard to get to. And so that's kind of slowed up, I would say, lending a bunch because of that. So, and applicants fall below that have restricted access. It doesn't mean you can't get credit. It just means that maybe the conditions will be more onerous. You have to put up more collateral. They're going to want you to borrow less money. Those types of things, more down payment, whatever the case may be, right? Or you end up going to the finance company that charges you extremely high interest rates too. So the Vantage score was one that they were putting into place. It hasn't really gained traction. It was really close to becoming, I think, kind of popular. What they were trying to do is just combine it. There's different credit scoring systems out there, and they were kind of trying to combine those and make them all similar, and it never really happened. And I think the FICO score still remains the industry standard. So why do I say I didn't like this? We ended up going to credit scoring, and we had our own program, and we could add some other variables and some other different things, and that was fine and dandy, and it actually made it way easier, way easier. But we couldn't make exceptions, okay? And the reason I didn't like it is because we were kind of forced to do it not because of the quality of our loans. They were fine. Our loan quality was really good, and our customers were fine and whatnot. But we were required because discrimination. If you made a loan to one person, made an exception for one person, and the government auditors came in and thought that here was this other person that had similar characteristics, you should have made an exception for them, and if you didn't, you were a discriminator. And so it really absolutely stopped us from making exceptions for folks. And oftentimes the folks were lower income, more in need of credit. They might have been my one customer who had the Chapter 13. By the time credit scoring came along, I think he'd either passed away or had ceased using credit and whatnot anyhow. But we wouldn't have been able to make an exception for somebody like him. It would have just been a credit score, pure and simple, and that's kind of the way it is now. And it's really depersonalized that. And for your generation, that's how you guys have grown up and probably how you like it. You'd much rather get online, type your information into a deal, some kind of an application thing online, and hit the submit button and see what it says. Just, it's impersonal. If the computer turns you down, you don't feel bad. You kind of shrug your shoulders and go, well, try the next one or something, right? That's the way it's going, and I'm fine with that. It's not, obviously how I was in business or what we did in business. So anyhow, credit reporting contains these things, right? Your trade lines, that's your lines that you might have, say, with Farm Plan, or now it's called John Deere Credit, right? Different things like that. Loan history that you've had perhaps at banks, credit unions, those types of things. Any collections. So if you didn't pay somebody, okay, and they turned it in for a collection, that can show up on your credit report. Now, I turn people in for collection every now and then as a landlord, right? Folks move out, they owe some rent, they owe some whatever the case may be, rent or maybe the damages, those types of things. And instead of me hounding them and trying to get it collected, I'll turn it over to a collection agency. And those things then show up on credit reports. Collection agencies are very good about making sure that stuff shows up on that credit report. Some legal actions, those that involve debts, of course, are on there. Credit are on there, and then some other information, name, address, telephone number, those types of things. Place of employment, maybe. 3 companies know them; they'll be on the test for sure. And then I'll try to, on the test, I'll try to confuse you. I'll make up a name that's kind of similar sounding to one of these, okay? And so you kind of need to know these ones for sure. TransUnion, Experience, and Equifax. Equifax seems to be the one in our country or our area that gets used the most. So okay, you get free access from to your own credit report at least once per year, and that's once at each of those 3 credit agencies. Okay, so the 3 that I had, the TransUnion, Experience, and Equifax, you can get one from each. So you can get 3 per year. So it's important to do that. Usually I think when I do this class in the spring is when I get my reminder then, and that I will then get on and get my own updated. So I think you should, because you'll see things that might show up on there. When I did mine one year, for example, I had this credit card that was on there that I hadn't seen or used or anything for 10 years. And so I did a little poking around, and I called, and it was no big deal. There's no balance or anything on it, but it was still in existence, and the account was still there, and on and on and on. And so I thought, that's kind of weird. And so by doing that, I was able to cancel it. And again, there's no harm done. But what if somebody had gotten a hold of that account and used it? Hell, I might not even known about it, and so kind of scary. Right? Consumer law, the modern view, the old view is freedom of contract. Caveat, like the buyer beware, right? Laissez-faire is, kind of you're on your own type of thing, right? We've gotten a little more modern view of that now. I'm skipping over some of this because I don't think you're going to see these types of things on the test, so I don't think I have anything really on the FTC. Deceptive, unfair advertising. I think that's important. You'll see deceptive advertising, and you'll see people called the task, or businesses, corporations called the task, because of that deceptive advertising. And it happens. I think you guys maybe even had a discussion or two in some of those cases. So again, I'm going to try to skip through some stuff here. Warranties. I don't know that I have anything like that on the test. Telemarketing. We prohibited some things, right? The do not call list came into effect. Wonderful, right? So you get on the do not call list, and folks, unless you already have a business relationship with them, can't call you. Charities and those types of places can still call you. And nothing there. I don't think it'll be on the test. Telemarketing and consumer fraud. State, we got the do not call list, outright bans on some of them, right? And then we do this. This is old because we do have a do not call list. I guess it did say that it had been on there. So, Reg Z, you need to know what Reg Z is. Reg Z is the Truth in Lending Disclosure Act, 1969. You'll see anytime you enter into a credit transaction, there should be something on there. It's probably called the Fed box, right? It's usually outlined in kind of bold line, and it will it'll tell you, and it should be fairly apples to apples comparison of what your APR is, or annual percentage rate, or that you're paying for that particular debt, and that forces the creditor to put into that consideration fees that they might charge you and things like that are a little bit maybe out of the ordinary, and it's complicated, some of the rules that go with creating those disclosures, but there's certain things that they have to disclose, and they do, and they include it in the interest rate so that you hopefully get an apples to apples comparison, and it's worthwhile checking. It's not unusual, like if you go to get a mortgage loan and you say they're quoting you 3 1/4, and you actually go sign it and it's 3.35, right? 10 basis points higher. That's not that unusual, and maybe to be expected. What they've done there is they've probably charged you a discount point and this and that. And they have to include those things in the disclosure. But if it's a big amount, if it's a big difference, maybe even if it's a small difference, and they added some things that they didn't tell you, you need to ask about it, and they need to be upfront about those types of things. So, Fair Credit Reporting Act. People can't report things that are untrue and things like that. You've got the right to protect your credit. State consumer laws, I don't think I asked anything about that. The thing about protecting your credit is this, and I think that was part of your assignment, and most of you guys had answered that. I think I've looked at some of those, and they were coming along fine. But make sure that if there's something erroneous on your credit report, that you write to the reporting agency or to the outfit that put it on there, or both. I would do both, okay, in written form, and say, hey, there's a problem with my credit report and it needs to get fixed, and do it now or else. And I had a buddy who somebody stole his identity and got a $500 credit card and racked it up and not paid it back, and he didn't realize that till they went to apply for a house loan, and he had this bad credit thing on his report. And you're like, what the heck? And he found out it was some guy in Pennsylvania or something. So obviously it wasn't him, and the guy had gotten this credit card. And so my buddy's calls. We'd go to lunch and he'd say, oh, I called him again, and this went on for about a month and a half. And so, how's it going? Well, I called them. They said they're going to take care of it, so I should be okay. And I said, I think you're going to have to write them. And finally, after about 2 months or so, he finally sits down and writes him a letter and send it off, like I suggested. And sure enough, it got taken care of after the letter. And so maybe it's changed. It's worth a phone call or two possibly. But I think at some point in time, you really want to make darn sure that you send a letter, keep copies, maybe even send it certified, and tell them, fix this or else. And that's, they actually have certain responsibilities. Phone calls, they don't have any responsibility. There's really nothing in the law that they're required to do based on phone calls. But written, and if you got a written record of it, they know and they understand that they have 60 days in order to make some changes if there are in fact errors. So what's left? There you go. You guys, it'll be a little sooner than that, so be here in December. Okay, so here we are. Yeah, here we are. The end. This might be the last time you guys hear from me. Oh darn, I'll bet you're just broken up about that. So nearly an hour. Man, that's still pretty quick to go through both of those, so it might take me a couple hours in a regular classroom. I hope everybody had a wonderful and safe Thanksgiving, and Your tests and whatnot are going to be due this Sunday, so get those done. Holler if you have any questions, and I know a lot of you I'll maybe see next semester, and to the rest of you, well, to all of you, good luck and best wishes.